yellow pen. Look on, no hands. Look on, no frame, no shame. Numb me up like cocaine. Can't focus, shake again. Which moment makes a man? 'Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and laypeople, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Brad Youngren, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this podcast for quite some time, and it's really a delight to have you here. And now I'm going to grill you with questions, so be prepared. But before we get into your considerable insight into healthcare today, particularly with regards to telemedicine, I want to explore a little bit your background and how you got where you are. And first of all, where did you grow up and what were you thinking about, what I want to be when I grow up when you were a kid?
I grew up in Southern California, spent a lot of time in the water, swimming and playing water polo. Those are my primary childhood activities. I sort of had thought about going to medicine for quite some time, originally thought about heading into the world of sports medicine, but somewhere along the way, got really enamored with humanitarian medicine and disaster medicine. That's sort of what led me to eventually get into emergency medicine down the road.
Is there a history of physicians in your family, or is there any tradition that you were following, or is this just something that came out of the blue for you?
Yeah, I think I'm actually the first physician in my family, but I went to the military medical school, and so I was third generation Army. So there was quite a bit of connection there and connective tissue with my decision to join the military for medical school and beyond for the first portion of my career.
You went to high school in California then? Is that did you spend most of your time there? You mentioned military, and sometimes folks move around a bit related to that, but were you settled by that time?
Oh yeah, my father was a reservist most of the career, at least for the part of the career that I was alive for. So I never really experienced him on full-time active duty. So I lived in Southern California almost my entire childhood, and then went to undergraduate at UCLA. So I didn't end up going too far away.
Was that by design? Did you always believe that you wanted to stay close to home to go to college? How'd you make that decision?
Well, I was looking at playing water polo in college. It was at the time of my life, it was a focus of interest of mine. Spent a lot of time doing it. I actually was going to go to the University of Michigan, and then a few weeks before the final decision date, friends started sending me information about how cold Ann Arbor got in December, and I literally was like sitting on the beach going, am I really ready for that? And so
I'm a Southern California boy.
So admittedly, I decided, I think I'll just stay in LA.
Yeah. Well, great schools, both of them, but that's comfort wins sometimes. And so, at UCLA, were you pre-med then?
There's actually no pre-med degree there at UCLA. So when I showed up for my first year, they just asked me to pick whatever, anything I wanted, and then I would take the required pre-medical classes. So really you could do anything. So I actually ended up focusing political science degree with emphasis on Latin American governments / pre-med, which was my sort of what I left UCLA with.
Yeah. But you know what? I think that it's valuable for those who go into medicine to venture outside the sciences a little bit and to have another interest. I think it broadens the perspective. And did that ring true for you, or how do you think about your major now?
I think it was a great choice for me. I learned how to write. I learned an approach to analytical thinking that I think if I had not done something like political science, I would have not exactly had the rigor around. So all the science classes come in due time. And so and I really, being at UCLA, studying Latin American governments, there's quite a bit of diversity on campus. And I just learned a lot about a variety of topics that, wouldn't be my focus as a physician, but have really come up at interesting points throughout my career. Still have a great love for Central and South America, and spend a fair amount of time there on my free time.
So you visit regularly to that part of the world?
I do. It's my preferred area to go to. I speak Spanish fairly well, and just enjoy understanding the culture and history of those particular countries. And
is there a favorite spot that you go to?
I really honestly try and mix it up and try and always find areas that I've heard about from previous trips or things that have kind of been on my short list. So it's been very diverse across most of Central and South America. I've been over the last 20 years. And I mean, there's certainly more places to go, but I've been around a lot down there.
Yeah, cool. So now let's move into the next phase. You wound up going to medical school via the military. Where was that? I
decided to go to USU, Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. Yeah, I looked around coming out of college, and I'd had a little bit of exposure to the military. So that's why I kind of checked the box amongst all the, the primary applications you do. And then when I went out to visit the campus, I was just kind of sold on it. Like certainly the military service was foreign to me, other than, my father going away a couple weeks a year as a reservist. But the campus was at the time the newest medical school allopathic campus in the country. The resources were great. You come in matriculated as a second lieutenant, so you're not accruing debt. And I was very interested in the sort of global humanitarian medicine, which the military pre 9/11 was very focused on. So it seemed like it made good sense to me.
What was that experience like for you, transitioning from civilian life to military medical school?
Well, the good thing they do is the summer before medical school starts, you go to medical corps officer basic training. So that's to sort of level set the playing field. Here's how you wear a uniform. We're getting up in the morning doing PT and running. And so that sort of like gets you aligned with some of the basic military doctrine and, policies and procedures so when you get into medical school, you at least have a good foundation. So that was kind of the summer between college and med school.
Wow.
It was an interesting transition for me, but I think it did really well. It prepped me for medical school, the discipline, being able to spend the summer with a bunch of people who would be my eventual classmates really created some interesting bonds. And that's obviously at the end of the day, part of what is magical about military medicine is the longstanding bonds you can create in that small community.
My dad was in the Air Force and was a physician in the Air Force. I have no memory of that because, and he can go into the reserves, but I was actually born on a military base in Georgia. So I do have some history there. It's just not mine. And now those of us who are, around my age will immediately, when we think of military doctors, we think of MASH. Now, I don't know if you ever watched MASH or had the opportunity to watch MASH, but one of the things that came through on that is that doctors get a little bit of a bye when it comes to the military. Is that your experience, or I'm sure it wasn't like MASH. I'm quite sure of that. But what was it like in terms of, do you get any special treatment as a physician in the military?
My first part of the career was an academic military emergency medicine as an attending and associate medical director. So one of the lectures I used to give was, because you could take a scholarship from a regular medical school and then you finish regular medical school, then boom, you're in the military, just alongside the USU grads. And sort of one of the philosophies I always had, and I used to describe to medical students or interns, was you're really at a crossroads, which is, do you want to be a physician in the military or a military physician? And there's sometimes, that's how I sometimes parsed it out. There's a lot to learn to be a military physician. But my own bias was that the most important thing, you can do as the military medical leader for a combat unit is to have trusted relationships with the senior leaders of that organization so that you could make recommendations that could impact in saving lives. One way to do that is to garner trust with the combat line officers by being a military physician, not just a physician in the military. So running with them in the morning, whatever traditions they experience, which you may look at from the outside, say are superfluous, but then when you head down range with those same people for a year in real MASH combat, those decisions can have a significant impact on saving lives indirectly, just because you have the commander's ear. They think you have the soldier's best interest at heart in the decisions you're making. And that becomes incredibly important.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And so talk to us now about, you finished medical school. What was your first deployment? What was that like? What did you learn along the way?
So I did a 4-year emergency medicine residency program that at the time was combined with Madigan Army Medical Center in Tacoma, Washington, and University of Washington. So they actually allowed us to complete those residencies. In the earlier times after your internship, you typically go out for 2 years to a combat unit as the physician, but they were transitioning at that time to trying to get people done with their residencies first. So they had a higher level of training completed when they did go out to the combat units. So while I was a resident, 9/11 happened. So the entire shift of the military medical operations occurred during that time. When I was a medical student, operations were in Bosnia and relief operations in Honduras after hurricanes, what I remember offhand.
Yeah.
That's the second I stepped out of residency and became a faculty. I was fortunate to stay at Madigan as a faculty, so I didn't actually have to leave my location, but I was assigned to a combat operations unit, which I ended up ultimately deploying with about 14, 16 months later.
How did that feel, and what went through your mind, and how did you prepare for that, and what surprised you about it?
Different kinds of tragedies tend to bring innovation, whether it's combat or pandemics. Lots of scientific innovation occurs in these periods of time. This ended up being no different. Lots of trauma advancements occurred, but prior to that, we were still operating on some information and knowledge based on the Vietnam War, as far as penetrating trauma, that kind of thing, and how to support combat operations in those times. So a lot of what we were dealing with was asymmetric warfare, a lot of the traditional, quote, echelons of care that have been really taken historically as far back as the Civil War, where there's this linear progression of care as you move away from the combat, the line of combat operations. Well, that doesn't apply when you're just essentially in a country where you're everywhere and nowhere all at the same time, and your enemy is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So it's completely asymmetric. So we really had to start reimagining how we got healthcare providers to the point of injury. And that was a really interesting experience, just to reimagine, because a lot of times you couldn't be in 20 places at once. So the question is, how do you get to that point of injury? Because you just don't know where it's going to happen. There isn't one front line of the battlefield anymore. And so we had to get really creative and figure out what's the best way to get medical hands on patients as fast as possible.
And you're constantly under threat as a physician, because there's no behind the lines. There's no place to go really to get away in that critical time period after injury to medical care. There's no place to go, is there?
Coming from a hospital, we're in the ED, you're working shifts and things like that, to the place. I mean, I was squadron surgeon, so I was taking care of a cavalry squadron that was stationed out of Talafar, so west of Mosul, and up and running across the Syrian, not across, but up near the Syrian border area. Taking care of people when every U.S. casualty that you take care of, personally, is very different than how we experience in traditional medicine. So it's just it's a different experience all the way around.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. That we are told so often that it is important to maintain some distance emotionally from the patient. In the military and in the deployments that you're talking about, that's not really possible. I mean, the relationship has already been established before the injury occurs. Did you find that interfered with your objectivity in any way? You're a professional, obviously, and I know the answer to that, but how did you manage that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I mean, I was still relatively young by military standards. I think it was maybe 33, 32, if I recall. But all my medics, 32 of them, were all, roughly about 18. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like I was their deployment father figure, like taking care of the preventive health needs of everyone in the organization, their medical problems.
Yeah.
If they're having problems at home with their family life, they're coming to you as the squadron surgeon because you're the only resource on the base that's not technically in their chain of command. You can also, retain some degree of privacy for them. And so, there's no way to avoid having intimate relationship with most of those people in that kind of scenario. And it certainly doesn't impact how we would do operations per se and making decisions about how to go about our business there. But certainly had a lasting impact. It made it the best and worst of all worlds. Because it's no greater honor than to be engaging and taking care of people care for and deeply, but it also does make it more challenging. So
yeah. So what happened? Well, first of all, and this sounds trite. It's said so often, but I actually mean it. Thank you for doing that, for doing what you do. It takes a special kind of person to commit to that. I really deeply appreciate the service that you provided for our country. I really do.
Thank you.
So how do you transition back to civilian life? When did you, are you still in the reserves now, or did you leave the military, or how did you make those decisions?
It was all really challenging for me to make the decisions. I just the operational tempo. I got out in 2010. I got out completely at the time. Left a lot of years of service on the table, but I just wanted to. Emergency physicians are many times the right kind of clinician to have downrange. And so the operational tempo, as we call it, the amount of deployments was very high for surgeons and very high for emergency medicine physicians in the military. And I just could see that wasn't likely to change. And I had young children. By that time, I didn't have anyone I had gone to combat, but I very much knew what that meant. The other thing we haven't really touched on yet is I just sort of tripped into getting involved in technology work for the Army. And I wanted to see what it was like to not have the constraints the military puts on you and to see where my interest in technology would go. I looked at a bunch of things staying in and doing this military academic fellowship where I could have got an MBA and stayed in and been a career military physician, which would have been a great career, no doubt. But I just had this inkling that I'd been in for so long. I didn't really know what it was like not to be in. And I wanted to kind of spread my wings, if you will, and see where the winds took me a bit. And I had an itch for technology. I could see how it was going to impact healthcare. And I thought I could really get deeper into that on my own terms outside of the military's choices about where I would be.
Talk to me a little bit about what roles you occupied after, since, leaving the military in 2010. What kinds of things did you do? And were you still actively practicing in the emergency department? How did that work?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about emergency medicine is you can dial up or dial down your clinical workload based on what other things you may have going on in your life, as long as you have. And my group has always been very supportive of that in Seattle. So I have, and I actually continue to maintain a clinical practice. I usually work 4 to 5 shifts a month somehow, fit that into my week. Yeah, but it's so different now for me, just because I get to take care of patients. I'm only there because I want to keep my skills up and take care of patients. I spend more time with them, not as worried as much about productivity anymore. And so I just find the job, really nice to keep that connection of patient care. And certainly through the pandemic, I felt a great sense of responsibility to contribute to that. My hospital was really the first wave of cases from EvergreenHealth, which is where I work. So overnight, my group was inundated with X number of ICU patients. We all had been taking care of those patients in the week prior unknowingly. And so, lots of things to work through there. So I felt a deep connection and responsibility there. But yeah, I think to go back, I've been doing a bunch of work in the military and ultrasound. The Sonosite 180 come out right around when the Iraq war started. And so we were looking at deploying the Sonosite 180s. I don't know if you recall those little, those are the first portable ultrasound machines. And so we were pushing those on the battlefield, and those kinds of technologies were starting to change the way we looked at triage and deciding who would be medevaced in an order, as an example, or where you may send the medevac bird based on the data you're getting from the points of injury. If you have 3 different points of injury at once. So this was some of the work we were doing. We were doing a video remote, reviewing images remotely, lots of relatively innovative stuff, 2004 time frame. Post-pandemic, everyone's done telemedicine. Everyone, to some degree, many patients have tasted telemedicine now. It's a very different world. But back then it was, so I ended up taking a job with a company called Mobisante. They were looking for a CMO. I was looking to transition to digital healthcare. They were the first FDA-approved mobile phone device in the country. So they were doing all the new studies that prove that a mobile phone device was essentially as good or better than traditional medical screens.
Yeah.
There's no 510K or predicate device for that kind of work. So it was an ultrasound machine plugged into a Windows phone. So you can march that out forward a bit since so we were building on a platform that doesn't really exist anymore. So that was challenging, but it was great. So I spent a number of years there. And then I was very excited. I just got into speaking about digital healthcare technology, primarily at tech conferences. What was interesting was the medical community wasn't really ready yet to talk about digital healthcare, but speaking at like Google I/O or many of those conferences were in the tech community was really interested to see how they could impact healthcare. People were excited about the notion of how technology could impact healthcare. It just wasn't fully integrated with the healthcare community yet. But so I spent a bunch of time speaking about digital healthcare. And then I realized, I needed to move out of this ultrasound job. And I went to a second company, which was a global health company, which was a lot of fun. And then I went to become the chief medical officer at Q Health before taking the job about 6 years ago at 98.6.
Yeah. So 98.6, I remember when I first, I think you guys were just coming out of stealth mode when I first ran across it. And instantly, it just made so much sense to me. Like you, I'd had an interest in the intersection of healthcare and technology. I was thinking about the same time you were doing the messing around with the Sonos. I was starting to roll out EICU at Banner, and you're right, it was a very different time. I think back all of the pushback that I got from docs at that time about, there's no way that this is going to work, and you can't tell what's going on, and telemedicine's not real medicine. So that has changed quite a bit. To update the listeners a little bit on where we're going with this, 98.6 is unique in that it was designed from the ground up to be text-based and on demand. So if you look at traditional telemedicine, often what one had to do, and still even today, is align schedules. And so if you want to see a doc, then you've got to have a video connection sitting down somewhere so that you can have a conversation with the doc in real time. It's an old model, really, for how that exchange takes place. It mitigates geographic concerns, but otherwise it's really pretty much the old model. And what 98.6 did that was, I think, revolutionary was to say, hey, everybody is using text these days. What if you could just text when you had a question or a need, and on demand you could get a board certified doc texting back to you? And that to me just made such perfect sense. So where'd that idea come from? How did that evolve?
The people that generated the idea were basically mostly just technologists who were looking where they could have an impact in healthcare. And after about a year or two of research, the decision was that primary care was really the best opportunity where you could drive technology into primary care medicine and have greatest impact. Now, I mean, it's interesting now, so many telemedicine companies talk about virtual primary care. But if we go back and look at historically speaking, back when we were doing it the first 2 or 3 years, we were the only ones talking about it in that context.
Yeah.
Patients needed help with preventive care and polychronic management. And if we could increase engagement in the primary care realm with healthcare providers and technology combined in this care delivery platform that we developed, which I think is fairly unique, then we could make a difference in the lives of patients. And that would also be a really scalable solution. The technology is incredibly scalable compared to what your or my reach are as a clinician, right? And so with a scarcity of resources, it makes great sense to imagine that primary care is most intimately impacted by technology. That was the theory. I think I came in around 20 or so employees. So they had been around making the technology alpha for about a year and a half.
Spend a little bit of time giving us some insight onto how you were thinking about 98.6 initially, as a novel way to address the telemedicine issue, and then how it's changed over the 6 years that you've been there.
We just started with a secure communication platform to observe and to interview patients. I mean, the theory was we needed to build the best replication of a patient-physician experience in the brick and mortar world. The more authenticity we could drive into that communication, even when we're using automation, was going to be particularly relevant. And so we tried. It's interesting. Like, we looked at everything under the sun, some things that other companies employ, expert systems, Bayesian principles, all that. And every time, especially back in 2015, the response from patients was, "This is cool." Like, then the second question is, well, is it like when you go see a doctor? And they're like, "No." And this was one of the big pivotal moments for us was, well, that's not what we're looking for here.
Yeah.
If you give patients only the opportunity to say yes or no in response to a question, I can only imagine doing that as a physician clinically. Like, patients would become frustrated within minutes. Our patient satisfaction scores would tank. And so we ultimately landed on this sort of decision that to do it right was going to take, we're going to have to play the long game. We're going to have to build an AI-based neural network that creates conversational AI between patients and doctors that most nearly replicates how that experience would occur if you're standing in person. And so that was the fundamental approach that drove the company from the early days.
What's your take on, how the pandemic has changed? We all know that telemedicine shot up during the pandemic, not a big secret as to why. I mean, distance was the rule of thumb when we had a rampant novel coronavirus running through the population. But it's dropped off again now. So where do you see the role of telemedicine? What's the long game for telemedicine? And, I even hesitate to call it telemedicine because that is almost an old school term now. It's really morphed into digital healthcare. And so I'm not going to corral you into one aspect of it, but how do you see the future evolving 98.6 and with other technologies?
Well, in the early years, to your point, I used to parse it out in two ways. One was, what are the video-based solutions? There are many, which in a lot of ways are just extensions of one-on-one analog communication between doctors and patients with all the limitations you can imagine there.
Yeah.
So it's like an extension of, I don't know what the percentages of brick and mortar cases could be achieved through video-based telemedicine, but it's certainly high enough where there's value there. But I think ultimately there's a bunch of limitations on where you can go with it because it's just video. It's just analog video services. And so digital primary care, digital healthcare, in my mind, is something much broader. It creates a system or a platform that allows you to leverage a variety of use cases. We used to start to talk about synchronous versus asynchronous, remote patient monitoring, right, AI technologies, leveraging data sets that are coming into your platform. All these things require a thoughtful approach when you start building the platform so you actually can capture that data. There's many successful companies that are using just white label video-based software, secure, and that's totally great. I think where we've been going is very different. It's, you can do video or phone, but the idea is, what does the patient want? Turns out they don't want always to do video. And if you want to get to a new place in digital healthcare, you have to sort of reimagine what it even means to see a doctor. Like why you would go see a physician, when is a video visit needed, when is sync versus async valuable, how does data integration impact that? How does the digital healthcare technology you develop integrate more broadly into healthcare? Like we never use the word disrupt at 98.6 primarily because, well, healthcare is just too big. We never believe you can disrupt healthcare. We needed to be innovative and the experts on technology, which I think we are, and to integrate within healthcare, partner with not only self-insured employers and health plans, also health systems. So across all aspects of healthcare to empower both the provider experience and the patient experience in new and innovative ways.
Right. So 98.6 has been at the forefront of, for example, integrating behavioral health into your offerings. The AI component continues to evolve and get better at that conversational exchange up front where basic information is collected before, the doc engages. Uh, what lessons have you learned along the way that, I don't know if you would have done things differently because then you wouldn't have learned those lessons, but what lessons have you learned along the way that you're taking with you into the future?
It's interesting too, just coming from the framework of being an emergency medicine physician where we're dealing with emergencies and tons of failures in the healthcare system. What I mean by that is if you take just one example, like high blood pressure, many of the cases we end up seeing in the ED aren't patients that have a hypertensive emergency, but they just are lost in the system. It could be something as simple as they take a blood pressure at 2 a.m. and it's high and they don't know what to do with that information. So they come to the ED. And I totally understand why patients do that. It's not I'm not pointing a finger at patients. I'm saying it's a failure on our part to be creative and imagine what patients have these devices at home. They're going to get readings at odd times. What is our plan to deal with these issues that come off past 5 p.m.? And ultimately too, the other thing I've learned, there's the component around how to innovate around care delivery. There's also this component around what I call patient aggregation, which essentially is just like when the patient is on your platform, how do you provide the most value for that patient in the moment? The easiest example would be, why do 80% of patients begin their healthcare journey on a search engine? Well, it's free and it's on demand. Those two principles were things we drove in the pricing model and the engagement model 90.6 because we wanted patients to press the 90.6 app when they had a question. They didn't have to wait till they were sick. They could find value across multiple dimensions of integrating with a physician-backed network. And so we think that that's a really important aspect of what we do now. And as we move forward with the digital healthcare technology component, that directionality, that patient aggregation, asking the question, what's the right thing for the patient in that moment? Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's a doctor, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the therapist, sometimes it's an MA, sometimes it's a nurse, and sometimes it's a referral to a subspecialist that isn't on the network, right? And so all those features, the more seamless all of that work is in one, will create a patient experience that will bring them back and have them be delighted with healthcare delivery, which is something we could all enjoy as healthcare providers.
When I think about ideal primary care, and maybe I'm not thinking about it expansively enough, but one of the issues that comes up for me is continuity of care. How does 98.6 think about that in the primary care space, and how do you ensure continuity? Is there a strategy that gets that done while at the same time offering that on-demand convenience? How does that work together?
Yeah, I think one of the early philosophies we had, which was borrowed from the computer science literature, was we knew looking at that research that patients can develop relationships with technology. And so, because you're not going to be able to give the same patient the same provider every time if you're going to drive a 24/7 on-demand service.
Right.
So what you need to do is have them build a trusted relationship with 98.6 first and foremost, and then go from there. So sometimes our patients do see the same provider twice. Just depends. Sometimes seeing the same provider is value add for the patient. Sometimes it's value add for 98.6. Many times it's for both. It just depends on the scenario. One of the things I've learned from working with so many folks from the worlds of Amazon and so forth that bring such interesting and different perspective than those of us that grew up in healthcare is asking the questions about, well, what is it the patient really needs in that moment? Is it, when you talk about continuity of care, does the patient need the same provider? Does the patient need to feel like the information is available for whoever they're talking to, whether it's a nurse, doctor, or therapist? Does the patient need to feel like the data is being transmitted to their health system EMR? There's many different ways you could look at that continuity of care. What's the seamless integration with subspecialty care, more broadly speaking, which I think is one of the more interesting nascent areas of digital healthcare. It gets only more complex as we start to peel it back and ask the hard questions, which is what is it that the patient actually needs in that moment?
Yeah, this raises for me another issue, which I'm interested to hear how you've handled it. And it's pretty simple. Doctors are different. Sometimes they make different decisions depending on where they were trained and how they were trained. I guess this has been well documented. There's a huge amount of variation in the delivery of medical care. So how did you work with the docs at 98.6 to get a consistent experience of care?
Well, I think one of the things that we did early on, which I still think is relatively unique was we didn't parse out parts of technology and then append them to care delivery. What I mean by that is we didn't build a symptom checker. We didn't go into saying we're building a symptom checker. We're going to build an advanced symptom checker, and then we're going to connect it to doctor. Turns out that doesn't work very well. If the doctor doesn't understand the technology, if the doctor has to go back to the beginning anyway, if the doctor doesn't understand how to use the data, there's a lot of different examples. It doesn't really work. By creating a platform that's always connecting physicians initially, and now we have many care providers, but to the technology and thinking about it always in that lens, you end up with different solutions. We're not looking at one specific problem. We're looking at hundreds of problems, and in bits of technology can improve the provider or patient experience. One of our philosophies has been always that physicians have been appended to every visit. There's no visit being taken care of by a bot, as an example. Everything is,
Gotcha.
We're just looking at it, providing tools. In some ways, I make the example that a CMI was asking me what I would want as a ED doc since I have digital healthcare experience. I said, you know what, I'm going to tell you that no one's asked that, but like I could tell you that like even if you just started texting me my labs on my phone as I'm working clinically, so I'm going room to room instead of hub and spoke model back to my computer console between each case to get data.
Yes.
I mean, that's what I'm talking about, where there's just basic stuff that has not been done in that context. And so it's just because those weren't the questions that the EMR companies were asking. They weren't asking us clinicians what we wanted that would make our jobs easier in the ED example. So we've taken the approach around how do we provide technology which drives the same or better quality that you get in a brick and mortar experience. I think we can actually do better sometimes. Interestingly, I'm happy to dig into why, but essentially when you're in the room of every case, every keystroke, you understand, you pick up things that the physician of record and the doctor and the patient both sometimes can miss in traditional practice.
Can you give us an example of that? That is fascinating.
When third-party clinicians in your medical group are doing peer-to-peer chart review of cases that aren't theirs, was there a miscommunication of language where those two individuals didn't understand each other in the moment? You can only pick up those kinds of subtleties when you have access to the data to understand what's happened in that context. And then you can iterate at a new standard, which is sometimes everyone's going to miss something and there's still an opportunity to do better.
Yeah. Now, this is cool because what you're pointing to is that because this is text-based, you can very easily capture every encounter for auditing, for quality control. And as you point out, picking up things perhaps that weren't obvious in the first go round. So that's a really different, easily electronically accessible opportunity that we haven't had before. Is that your experience?
Yeah, and that was one of the main drivers for my transition from my previous job to 98.6 was I felt like this is the greatest opportunity ever in healthcare to be in the room as many cases as possible. And then we didn't really know what happened behind the closed doors of those exam rooms sometimes.
Yeah.
I was looking at hypertension data early on from an institution, and because I was trying to understand how could we use that kind of data to train an AI-based system.
Right.
But when I stepped back and looked at the data, the fundamental problem was that the physicians in this data set were only following the guidelines 16 to 18% in a given month. So I had to ask myself, do I really want to train a system based on this very robust data set when the fundamental question is, if there is a standard guidelines, don't we want on one hand, we as physicians agree to that guideline. And granted, there's always outliers. Let's just give it a 5% outlier, whatever the case may be. But I think we all could agree that if there's a standard for hypertension management, we should be driving towards as close to 100% adherence to that as we can. We need to be in the room of every case. We need to be able to build technology that supports the adoption of standards of care when relevant and drives quality to new levels.
Yeah. The person who taught me the most about the value of standardization was probably Brent James. I don't know if you're familiar with Brent James, but he's been one of my healthcare heroes for a long time. And, he points out that the variation in healthcare is not benign. They can't all be doing it the right way. If there are 50 different ways of doing it, one way must be better than another. And the secret is until you have a standard, you have nothing against which to compare. There was an Italian group, and I don't remember all the details, but they had discovered that essentially an artificial lung reduced the mortality in something called ARDS, adult respiratory distress syndrome, significantly. I can't remember if it was 20% or something along those lines. And everybody was excited about that. And Alan Morris had the wisdom to ask, okay, but compared to what? Because it was compared to usual care. And so Intermountain actually did an evaluation of usual care, specifically with regards to ventilator management in their facilities. And what they found was there's huge variation, not just between physicians and how they responded to a set of ventilator parameters. What would you do with this was essentially what they were doing. But even the same doctor on a different day might have a different response. Now, in defense of the docs, there was at the time no real standard to look to. But what that prompted Intermountain to do was to develop one. And so they developed a standardized way of managing the ventilators. And what they found was that when they standardized the approach to ventilator management, the mortality gains the survival gains were exactly the same as this complicated machine. So the question had to be asked, was it the machine or was it a standardized approach to managing patients that actually made the difference? And that was an aha moment for me. We've all been told this is cookbook medicine and et cetera. And the analogy that I've always used is when you get up in the morning, do you say to yourself, I'm a doctor, so I'll drive on whatever side of the road I want to, and I'll pay attention to signs and if I want to? No, of course you don't. You give up some autonomy because there's a standardized set of rules that will allow you to get to where you're going safely. And so I think and the other point that you made is, I think, critically important, which is there are always exceptions. And the physician's role has increasingly become, yes, follow the standard, but pay attention because there will always be exceptions. You need to know what those are and when those occur so that you can deviate from that standardized protocol. One last thought, Intermountain, when they had a deviation from their ventilator standard, they asked the question, is this a necessary deviation? Or do we need to teach the doctor something, or is the doctor teaching us something? And they would change the protocol based on that assessment. And I think you're describing essentially the same approach to managing 98.6. Is that fairly consistent with how you think about it?
Yeah, I love the analogy. I mean, I think when you have a standard approach to any disease process, there's plenty of things that don't have a standardized approach, by the way. You and I know that. So there's these edge cases that will always exist. And that's why physicians have tons of training, and they're going to have to make the best case for that particular patient that is really off.
Yeah.
But you have to have a standard. You have to have a medical organization that's excited to iterate, improve, and learn, and has that self-introspection and capacity to say, this is good. And I'm humble in the face of medicine. And it could be me, it may not be me, but we're all in this together. Ultimately, to make a better patient experience, drive better outcomes, and for us, drive better technology. Because we are always asking the follow-up question, which is, okay, is there a piece of technology we could have built that will cover that scenario? Do we need to rebuild some of the tech, change some of the parameters, those kinds of questions? And I think for the medical group, that's one of the things they love about working for us. We have 60 full-time physicians. They get to make those changes. The engineers have given them tools to iterate and be empowered to make those changes. And that's really pretty unique for physician experience. And
so are there any quality metrics as a group that you follow and hold yourselves to? Are there specific performance metrics that you look at on? And I'm not talking so much about managing the docs as I am about managing medicine.
Yeah, I think when we started, we basically just stood up a quality management system. A bunch of us came from healthcare, had run those kinds of organizations. So we had a case the first month. I remember when we weren't even on mobile yet. So this is very early on, and the patient couldn't figure out how to get their camera to work, but the doctor had asked for a photo. The question became in quality management review is, well, this is interesting. This is a whole new thing. Like, does that how do we quantify that workflow? And that's just sort of a simple example of things like you have to start to work through as a medical group. Like if you ask for tech's not available, what does that mean? What do you do in those instances? And the first month where you're starting to find things, that's what I knew was going to be really exciting, was just by being in the room, looking at the cases, being critical, and demanding excellence and improvement as an organization allowed us to kind of move from what would be looked at as a traditional quality management program like a health system would have to something that's a bit different.
What's new at 98.6, and what do you see as the future of 98.6? What's going on now, and where are you headed?
Well, I mean, one of the big announcements we made in September was our partnership with Multi-Care Health System in the Pacific Northwest. And so we are essentially working with health systems now, which is our newest endeavor. We've been working with health plans and employers for years, but to enable them to compete digitally in the market space. And so I think some of the things that have been going on, Amazon's purchase of One Medical would be they're finally looking at this saying this is a legitimate threat to patient acquisition. And I still believe most patients identify with the brand of the health system they go see. And so that's, I think, the advantage health systems have. And then we're working with health systems as technology / digital healthcare experts to empower them to provide exceptional digital experiences for the patients that they're already attributed to their to their brand, to their network, whatever way you may look at it. So that's really exciting. And it's also really fun to show what we've done the last 6 years to people from healthcare, because they get it. All the stuff we've been talking about the last 45 minutes or whatever, like when I show demos of how the product works, the excitement I could see in chief medical officers' faces, CEOs' faces, whatever the case may be, chief nursing officers, all of the above. That's really been a focus of mine. And sort of like that announcement in September was a big deal for us because it finally told a bit to the market what we're doing, or what we have been doing, frankly, for a while.
So what you're doing really is providing a service to providers at this point, whereas you've been working at it from the other side. And does that mean that you're providing call coverage? Are you white labeling? How are you offering that to, let's say I'm a provider organization in Tennessee, and I've got something in mind because one of my buddies runs it, Holston Medical Group in Kingsport, which is very progressive group, but what would you be able to offer to them to expand their ability to provide telemedicine?
Yeah, I think in that example, I view them as the brand with a capital B, and 98.6 is the brand with a lowercase b, where we want to empower a patient experience which is consistent with that allows them to identify that this digital experience is related to what they already know, the providers they already know, the health system they already know, the integrated network they already know. And one of the things we can do, though, is take a lot of the learnings we have at 90.6 with our own medical group over the last 6 years around an example will be workforce management. So we've been 24/7 on demand for some time, where we've spent a lot of time. We have a very cross-functional workforce management team, data scientists, experts from many other fields, because it turns out bringing people outside of healthcare can really help you understand how to build a schedule and support structure to manage a 24/7 operation. We understand digital healthcare delivery pretty well now. Many health systems have dipped their toes in video-based telemedicine, but really what I found is could use the benefit of some of our teams to help support them to whatever goals they may have. If you want a certain response time to keep a patient waiting X number of minutes, I can tell you exactly how much that's going to cost you, as an example.
Yeah.
So basic stuff like that, which is, and that's important as health systems are standing up more broad-based digital solutions, is you need to understand what it is you're providing, what the costs related to that service delivery standard is, and what the outcomes are going to be.
Does telemedicine save the healthcare system money, or can it? And the reason I'm asking this, Brad, is think about it as the debate that's ongoing now. We're not sure exactly where it's going to land, but currently there is parity. I mean, a telemedicine visit is paid equal to an in-person visit. Is the are the overheads comparable for those two strategies? Should it be something less than that?
Look, I think for me, it's multifaceted. One is we're seeing more burnout and more physicians talking about leaving practice than we've ever seen in healthcare, maybe in the last 100 years. That is frightening to imagine at a time when capacity is already stretched.
Yeah.
We need to create digital healthcare technologies that provide long, exciting careers for professionals, just as much as the technology needs to improve outcomes, just as much as the technology needs to create a new enhanced patient experience as well. I believe it can do all of that. I think it can do it in the traditional fee-for-service model, but anytime you're stuck in the fee-for-service model and talking about reimbursement and how much time did you spend with the patient, parity building I think has been good for helping keep traditional telemedicine going within healthcare, although a lot of the data suggests it's been waning off. And I think that's probably mostly related to some of this infrastructure that's been built. I think the biggest opportunity is ultimately around ACO populations or capitated models where
yes,
the technology you build, patient-facing quality, efficiency is all relevant towards providing high-quality, low-cost medicine. And now all incentives are appropriately aligned in that instance, I think, where digital healthcare, I think, will be the cornerstone of what that type of work looks like, ACO or capitated model, look like 10 years from now. Like,
gotcha.
If you want to understand cost, quality, and access, you're going to drive patients through a digital platform first. Not that everything can be completed that way, but certainly as a starting point for directionality for some types of care, it makes perfect sense to me that every patient journey should start there.
All right. Now I'm going to throw you one last question. It's a little bit out of left field, and it's going to put you on the spot just a little bit. So I just want to get your adrenals squeezed slightly before I ask it. Can you name a book, a podcast, or a movie that you've discovered in the last couple of years that you would say, now that's something everybody should see?
I listen to, for the most part, one podcast on a regular basis, and you're the one that turned me on to it, but I'm kind of a fanatic, which is Peter Attia's The Drive. So I love his work. And I think a lot of the things he talks about, I'm always listening to these podcasts with experts, and I love the rigor and the science, the level of science that goes into his analysis and the people he brings on. But I think personalized genomics, personalized medicine, longevity issues, all that could be driven through a digitally-based experience for sure. So that still remains, thanks to you, one of my favorite listening events of the week. I think books I've read that have been really impactful. Robert Pearl's book was, I think, a really excellent book. I just finished Michael Easter's book called The Comfort Crisis. And so
on your recommendation, I read that. And yes, that was a great book. It really was.
It was really interesting. So, on a personal level, I'm very interested in a lot of the issues that are covered in The Drive, longevity, living a higher quality life and living a longer life. And what is the impact of diagnostics, technology in that journey? Even just for myself as a patient is a big area of focus for me.
Yeah, you and I are very much aligned on that. The Drive with Peter Attia remains one of my very favorites. The other one that I've found that's very interesting that I just stumbled across is a fellow named Russ Roberts who does Econ Talk. Have you ever heard that? He does a variety of guests from, here, there, and everywhere. But I just find his podcast to be informative and in a different way than Attia's, in that it takes people from all walks of life, sometimes economists, sometimes scientists in different fields, sometimes popular, and he just asks them great questions. So that's the other recommendation that I'd make, Brad, is to check out Econ Talk.
It's interesting. Like I've had to, in my schedule, I blocked out time to listen to podcasts now because no longer am I commuting as much as I used to in a car where I would get all my podcasting listening done. So get that data consumed. So it's interesting how the pandemic has changed things.
Brad, it has been a great pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to the time when we can see each other in person again. It's been quite a while, and we always have a great conversation. So thank you for allowing me to record this one. And with that, I think we are going to say so long from the Groves Connection until next time.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on the Groves Connection.